Welcome back. This is part 2 of a 2-part series in which we are looking at this custom computer that I built a few years ago and then ended up selling. Back in part 1, I mentioned that the new owner of this machine wanted me to take the contents of the original hard drive, which was this Western Digital Raptor series hard drive. Now this is a 10,000 RPM drive that has a capacity of 74 gigabytes. And we copied the contents of that to this new Samsung EVO 850 500 gigabyte SSD. And while I had many problems trying to do that, we did actually conquer in the end and get everything up to snuff the way we wanted it to. Now, in case you're wondering about this drive here, this is a Toshiba 5400 RPM 320 gigabyte drive. And originally when I set this machine up, this was the data drive that contained all the music and movies and that kind of stuff, documents and whatnot. And this was the main drive that just contained the operating system. Now I will back up here a second and say that this machine as it is right now is built as a spare parts machine. You see, this case was purchased so it fit into my rack system, and I had an audio interface and a bunch of other stuff installed with this particular computer. So if I actually wanted to, I can put a front and back to the case on this thing and pack it up and take it somewhere and become a portable recording studio. And that's kind of the idea I had with it. The problem is the motherboard, the processor, the RAM, and everything else that I chose for this came from my main computer. And I was intending to repurpose the parts as a new studio computer and then build myself a new computer. And well, that never came to fruition, unfortunately. The guts ended up going back in the original desktop computer that I had, and I ended up just making this into a spare parts machine. So the motherboard and the processor that wasn't here, the RAM that wasn't here, the Nvidia GeForce 6800 video card, this hard drive, and this hard drive all came from somewhere else. The fans that are in here, the power supply, and maybe a couple other things that aren't part of this any longer were part of the original build. Like I had a fan speed controller in this bay here. But anyway, everything kind of went shuffling about. I got this computer back up and running again, and I left it as is, as the spare parts machine. And I actually ended up taking whatever audio equipment and whatever audio programs I had on my main computer and installed it into this machine. It sat there for a few months, and then I ended up selling the whole bunch. And I've mentioned this many times before. I had everything. I used to DJ. I went into music production through a band that I ended up joining, and I started as being the band's DJ, and then I became the sound guy, and I bought all this equipment to end up recording us. And every night I had a CD in everyone's hands as they left, and it's a big long-winded thing. But anyway, when I sold this equipment, the new person who picked it up was in awe that, hey, you got this nice built computer here in this rack mount case. And they decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and upgrade the processor, I'm going to upgrade the RAM. I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's a card right over here. This is a high-end audio capture card. I think it's a Lynx card, if I remember correctly. And obviously he replaced the hard drive with an SSD, and the rest is kind of history. But now here I have it on my desk. There are some things we have to do still. I have to mount these two drives in the proper holder. We also have to modify the power supply to include another power SATA connection. There are only 2 and we do need 3. The reason why we didn't need 3 of them before, one of them was being used for this hard drive, the other one is used for the SATA DVD drive. But the old Raptor drive, you can notice, actually has the IDE power and SATA power. This is meant to integrate into older machines. I didn't mention before, but this is actually only SATA 1, so this has a speed of 1.5 gigabits per second max, whereas this one's SATA 2, it can go up to 3 gigabits per second max. This one's SATA 3, which is obviously 6 gigabits per sec. Unfortunately, there's no SATA 3 ports on this computer, only SATA 2. And that's a disadvantage for this guy because it's only 1.5 as opposed to 3. So even though this one spins at twice the speed of this guy, you don't really get much difference in transfer rate because this one's being bottlenecked by the actual board itself. Just to give you an idea, the sequential read speed on this drive was 67.35, it was 63.68 on this drive and 263.6 on this drive. So it's a humongous difference in speed on the SSD as compared to the other drives, obviously. And to give you some real world numbers, this computer took just about a minute to boot from cold boot up to the desktop, and only 37 seconds on the SSD. So there's definitely a big improvement there on just the speed of the machine. Not only that, but go back and watch part 1. This thing sounds like it's very loud for a hard drive. And again, spare parts. I purchased this specifically for a server that I had because I knew that Windows Home Server takes the hard drive and partitions it into 2 sections, one for the OS and then the other one for the actual files itself. And the OS partition actually doesn't take up as much room, so what I did was bought this on eBay and put the operating system directly on this drive just to speed it up a little bit. But I didn't really pay attention to the whole SATA 1, SATA 2 thing. Now that server actually has a 300 gigabyte Raptor drive in it, which is SATA 3, and it's much better than it was originally. But back to this machine. There are some things about this that I liked when I bought it. It already had a bracket set up for the 2.5-inch hard drives, and that's this guy here. You can put 2 of them in there side by side, and this fits right here in the back above the power supply, which is nice. Then there's also a big tray here, which I have on my desk. And this goes in this spot right here, and you can actually mount 2 hard drives top to bottom. The problem is if you have any kind of expansion cards like these guys here, you can't, because those expansion cards sit into this area here. So this tab does have to be bent out of place. It can be put either way around, but so this big drive here was actually sitting upside down, and it fit in here just like this, and it sat right up here on top. So that's not going back in, although I will put the plate back in for stability. But what I'm going to do now is just pitch my camera forward a little bit, and we'll try to get a peek inside here. Now there's a set of fans up here, and there's also another set of fans up front here that you really can't see right now. But those are all Silence branded fans. I wanted to make this computer run as quietly as possible. Although there is a graphics card in here. And this computer does have onboard video. There really is no need to have this in here. It's spare parts, so I just threw it in here and it just went with the machine. But I don't know if you can hear it. There's actually 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 fans in here total. Out of all of them, it sounds like the actual graphics card's fan is louder than the rest of them. And I don't have a scientific way to really test that. The only thing I can do is if you just stall out the fans, which I don't really recommend doing, but if I stall out, like let's say the CPU fan, I don't really hear that. If I do these guys here, I don't really hear that, you know. All these ones in here, I can't get to the power supply fan, so I can't really tell if that's making a lot of noise or not. But I was speaking with the owner and said, you know, what's your main thing about this computer besides the SSDs? Like, can you please find a way to make it quieter for me? And I said that was kind of the idea of when I put in the Silence branded fans, but I can't vouch for the other components. I bought a cheapy power supply because I didn't want this thing to be too expensive. So it's not like a silent power supply. When he did the actual processor upgrade, he just bought one off of eBay. He went for the maximum he could put in this thing, which is the Core 2 Duo 8600 running at 3.34 gigahertz. It just took the stock cooler that came with the motherboard, and this cooler actually, again, spare parts. I had the board. The story of the board, somebody gave it to me, but they had the wrong size processor in there. It fit physically, but it wouldn't fit hardware wise. Like, it didn't have the right specification and the thing didn't work, so he just gave up on it. Actually, somebody gave it to him and said, hey, this thing doesn't work, maybe you can figure it out, and he just had it in a box and never looked at it. So both of their losses is my gain, I guess you could say, but I just slapped a regular cooler on top of it. You could theoretically get a silent cooler, it'd be a much bigger thing, and you can get a silent video card, believe it or not, but I don't really think this machine needs a video card. Now, this was an Nvidia GeForce 6800. On board though, it does have, like I said, a graphics card. It actually has the Intel Graphics Media Accelerator X4500, and again, I don't have a side-by-side comparison. There are some things that I saw that obviously the GeForce card is going to excel in, like the amount of RAM it has compared to using onboard RAM, but we're not playing any graphics stuff on here. It's kind of a catch-22. So what I'm thinking of doing is actually running some numbers on this machine as it is right now and taking that card out and see if we get any improvements. And one of the things I want to do right now is the Windows Experience Index and see where we fall. Now the index has a scale of 1.0 to 7.9, and your lowest score determines on what the overall score of the machine is. So if we focus over to the monitor for a second, we can see the different categories: processor, memory, graphics for gaming, and primary hard disk. It gave this computer a 4.7 because the lowest score was the 4.7. And I can tell you, if we run down the numbers, it gave the processor a 6.5, RAM also 6.5, 5.7 on graphics, 4.7 on the gaming graphics, and right now it says the hard drive's a 7.5. Originally, it had this hard drive clock that's 5.9. So that's a pretty big jump from 5.9 up to 7.5. And I'm pretty happy with that myself. But what I'm going to do is actually, like I said, shut this down, take out that graphics card, and we're going to see if any of those numbers change for the better or for the worse. Hopefully, best case scenario, it changes for the better, and that way we can justify not needing it in there, and that should also help with the noise. And with that, I'm going to try to gently take my microphone here and just place it inside the case and get a baseline for sound. Alright, let's go ahead, shut this down, and see what happens. All right, well, that answered our question. You can see it actually dropped the graphics down to 4.4 from 5.7, and the gaming from 4.7 down to 3.6. Again, we don't really care about gaming, but given that there wasn't really any improvement to the general gist of the computer here, I'm going to go ahead and put that card back in. Now, while the computer's shut down, I'm going to go ahead and actually get the rest of this taken care of here as far as that wire is concerned that we have to solder in and mount the drives and whatnot. So the first thing I'm going to do is just disconnect all these data cables and just get all this kind of stuff out my way here. Now, since the graphics card does technically have to be in here, I thought maybe if we took the high-end audio card here and moved it over to the next PCI slot, that'll at least give a little bit of a buffer space between the graphics card and the audio card, and maybe it might not overheat as much. Not saying it is overheating, but I just think better airflow might not make it run so fast. So I'm going to go ahead and move that over too while I'm here. By the way, these wires here are for the little USB headers that are up at the top here that I added in extra. And if you're curious to what the audio card looks like, it's this Lynx AES16 card, and this basically just has a set of breakout cables here that would plug in and give you the various inputs, outputs that you need to record your audio from. Pretty neat device. I used to have something like this back in the day from Roland, but I ended up going over to a USB based system. One thing I'll mention, this is a micro ATX motherboard, and you can see by this last slot over here, there was very little room in this thing once you actually get everything laid out. Maybe they could have actually put the power supply sideways in here, but then you might not have room for this little cage. Yeah, space is at a premium inside this thing, that's for sure. And it actually could fit a larger motherboard, believe it or not. Larger this way. All right, that's all taken care of. And one of the things I actually had to do was get a longer SATA cable. This orange one was originally the one that was in here, and it just kind of came up and sat up here in this location. Now it needs to go back there, and it's just not quite long enough. So I found this blue one, and just to keep it easier to identify what's what in here, I'm going to actually use this one for the DVD drive, and I'll use these two for the hard drives that are in here, just to make it easy. So what I want to actually do now is get the power supply out. To do that, there's 4 screws in the back over here, and it should come out through this opening. I might have to move this out the way, and it's not just a matter of undoing these screws and sliding this forward like a regular case would be. There's actually 2 more screws that are inside here, so this whole assembly gets pulled out, and it's kind of a pain in the butt. Now, if I can avoid that, that'll be great. If not, it'll have to come out. So let's see what I can come up with. And all I gotta do is tip it back, and it should come out pretty nicely. Oh, I do have to still disconnect it from the motherboard. There's only 2 connections. One is this main one that goes right down to the board, right about there, and then the other one goes behind here. Now this one might be tricky because this fan's in the way. See, this is what I mean by everything in this case is very tight. Also, this power supply, you can see they have the main cord here sleeved, which is nice, but none of the other ones are sleeved. And in case you're wondering how big this is and what this is a Kentech 680 watt power supply. If I remember correctly, I only wanted a 500 and something watt power supply, and they ended up sending me this instead. Of course, no complaints. Let's see if I can fish this wire out without having to take the fans out. Yeah, there we go. All right, so now I'll get this computer off the bench here and we can try to solder these wires in. Now, I don't really need a lot of room. This cord is plenty long as it is. Everything is gonna go right above this, basically. Best case scenario is I can actually open this up and solder these wires directly to the board. So that's gonna be the neatest way. If not, we can find the original stack that has these on them, which is gonna be this one here. And you can tell because SATA has the red 3.3 volt line going to it. I haven't really seen any devices actually use that. They always use either the yellow 12 volt or the red 5 volt line. But either way, we could either intercept this wire here, let's say, and snip it and just have this come out with those, which wouldn't be a bad idea, you know? Or like I said, we could try to get it directly on the board. Now, you may notice from looking at this, none of these other wires have that orange lead going to them, other than the big fat cord here going to the motherboard, because nothing else really uses 3.3 volt. It does look like the QC pass sticker was already removed on this. I don't remember if I opened this up or not, but either way, it's past the warranty point. So I think it's going to be worth our while to open this up and see what we can find inside of it. And this is where we're looking in here. It's kind of hard to see from this angle, but there does appear to be some spots that are actually clear back here where we could pass that wire through. But I'll have to take this out. There's a couple screws in the corners here. It should pop out. Sometimes you have to undo these wires over here. Now, I'm going to give a very big word of caution here. If you ever work on these power supplies, be very, very careful, especially when they're just powered up like this one was. There's two very large capacitors here. They could potentially shock the hell out of you. So be very careful, especially working on the other side of this board. But we'll see what we can find here when I get this out. Now, while it might not be evidently clear immediately, you can actually see these are the different pads over here we're going to utilize. And there are actually some open holes. Like this one right below my thumb here, you can just see the open hole. There are some other ones that there's no wire in it, but the solder ended up filling up the hole anyway. So I do have to clear those out first, but we should be able to just patch these right in. Now we need the 3.3 volt, the 5 volt, and the 12 volt lines hooked up. We also need 2 grounds. Now the grounds are all hooked up together, so as long as one of these makes connection, it should still work. But if we could find 2 holes, that'd be even better. Also very interesting, this is big botch job down here. I guess the trace didn't have enough current capability, so they had to put this large wire on the back here to carry some more power. Kind of intriguing. But what do you expect for a cheapy power supply? All right, let me go ahead and get some of these holes cleaned up here and see what we can get done. Here you can see all the holes. There's one up here for 3.3. There's one here for 5 volt. There's one here for 12 volt. And then there's 2 down here for the grounds. So that should be perfect. Let's get those wires snuck in there and taken care of. All right, and as you can see, there's that wire in. That was actually really easy to do. So I'm just gonna fish this out through the case, and that's pretty much it. Let's put this all back together. You can see actually I put some zip ties on here too to hold this together. There were on there originally. I just snipped them off when I salvaged this wire. But yeah, so let's get this back together. I have to say, this looks like this belongs. You wouldn't really even be able to tell that this was spliced in or added in extra. The only thing that maybe gives it away is it's a little neater because there's more zip ties on it. You can see this one, they only really have it at the end, and the rest of the wire is kind of sloppy. I kind of have a pet peeve about these power supplies. First off, I don't like when they only sleeve the one cable. It looks a lot neater when they do, and why wouldn't you do everything else? The other thing is, well, when you route these wires through this hole, see the one I did is all nice and neat, it's one bundle, but some of these go through some of the other ones, and it becomes a big tangle up here at the end. As long as the ends aren't tangled, I guess it's fine, but I really like the modular ones, like the one that I have in my PC, where it actually has a bank of outputs, and if you don't need the wire, then you're not going to use it. For example, right now, we don't have any IDE connections at all in this computer. So technically, there's one bundle, here's a second bundle we don't need. So theoretically, I could actually just eliminate those. In fact, I've done that before with other computers where they were built into specialty cases with specialty power supplies where you can only hook up. I think I had 2 SATA devices, so this would be perfect. But that's all I needed. I didn't need the 4-pin plug for the processor, any of that stuff. So I just ended up having just this main power connector, which you always need, and then the one SATA connection, and then everything else I just desoldered from the board and actually made it nice and neat. But yeah, we can route some of these wires neatly inside. In fact, a lot of these will just be zip tied up and then stuck behind the case here. The other thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take the 2 small hard drives and I'm going to mount them into the cage, which you may remember was this guy here. This is the outside of the case, this is the inside, so I'll probably put the SSD on the outer side since it's a little thinner and it needs less room. Alright, that was put together pretty easily. Now let's get this all put back together in the case. So this is going to sit above the power supply just like this, so these ports are exposed. Before I do that, I'll give you a good look inside this case since a lot of the wires are now out of it, just so you can get an idea of size. And as mentioned, this is a micro ATX motherboard. And you can see the thin fans that I specifically sourced for this computer to fit in here. So if you had a larger motherboard, which originally I did, it fit a lot better. The board I had 4 slots for RAM and everything, so it had to be a lot longer for that reason. But this is nice and compact, it fits pretty well. And you still have all this dead space down the bottom here, so if you really want, you can pass some of the wires through here and everything, make it like nice and neat. So that's pretty much that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just get everything situated in here. All right, everything's put together with the exception of the large bracket that goes up here to hold the 3.5-inch hard drive. That I've left out just to keep it neat in here. I will put it back in before I close the case up, but I just figured I'd show you guys what this looks like. So you see, even though it's a pretty open case, wire management's pretty good in it. I just put a little zip tie here on all the data lines. They're all kind of running along this way. I remember the 2 red ones are the hard drives and the blue one's going to be for the DVD. So that comes in nice and neat. It's nice that all these drives are right here next to each other because I just use one of the SATA cables that loop. So it comes out of one drive into the next. They all run along here between the power supply and the CPU. And then all the additional wires are tucked in. Now these 2 rear fans are powered up all the time. There's no speed control or anything, unlike the front fans which are powered off the motherboard. That's something that I actually switched over when I got this in my hands. These were powered off the power supply directly, so now they can regulate a little bit. But they go down to a little splitter that's just off camera up here and go directly down to the motherboard. The other 2 here also go to a splitter, and then they go with the rest of these wires here. You can see this little clear cable, and that goes underneath this section here where I actually have a little device that takes the power supply and converts it to a fan output, which is this guy here. And this just, you can see, it just plugs in one end, and then you can stick this in the back of a device or something and get a fan output. The only thing about this, it only provides 12 volts, so you can't regulate the fan speed at all. That's why I had the fan control in here originally. The only thing I have left to do, as I mentioned, is put this bracket in up on top and find a blank for the corner over here so I can cover that port up. Other than that, it's pretty much good to go. And there you can see the PCI bracket in and the hard drive bracket also in. So you can see once you put this in, it really takes away a lot of the room that's left over. It doesn't really hinder airflow at all, but space is at a premium in this little case. It's actually not that bad. I mean, if you had a second optical drive, that might hit the corner of the power supply here. So there's only certain things that will fit in this. Luckily, the fan controller was a short device, so that fit in there pretty well. And then there is one last thing to point out, is the top lid. So this just snaps like this. But you may notice this fan that's here. And I made mention of this in the beginning of the last episode and said in this episode I would tell you what that was for. Well, obviously it's an exhaust fan. It's meant to blow up and out. Since hot air rises, the majority of the heat's going to sit at the top of the case here, especially since there's the graphics card and there's also that high-end audio card right here. I was afraid that the other stuff in the back here, these 2 guys, wouldn't really have much effect. Now keep in mind, the whole back of this case is vented, which is nice, but the power supply here is supposed to be pulling air out. The fan faces down, so normally this is at the top of the case and all the heat rises this way towards the top and then it pulls it out. But since this is oriented sideways, it's not really doing that. So the fan in this is really just keeping itself cool. It's not really effectively pulling any air out. And these tiny little fans, I think they're 40 millimeter or 60 millimeter. They're not very big. You want like 80 or maybe big 120 sitting back here. But obviously again, space is at the premium. Maybe they could have changed the design a little bit in this, where this indented out and they could have put one big fan here instead. I'm not really sure. But I figured since this was in a rack and it was getting kind of warm and everything else, I ended up putting this fan up here. But you may be asking, why is there a wire coming out of it instead of going into the computer? Well, I wanted to be able to power this from an external power supply. And that way, when I'm not using the computer, the fan can keep running and cool down the machine, just pull the extra heat out of it. It's probably not necessary, but it's just something that I decided to do. You're probably also asking, well then, what did you use to control the fan? Well, I'll show you the prototype. It's this little block of wood. And this is what's called an on-off-on switch. And you may see there's 2 LEDs in the sides over here. If you flick it it in this direction, this LED would light and it would power up a 5-volt relay, which is this guy right here. And what would happen is whatever power coming in would come into this side over here, positive in the outside, negative in the middle. It would flow through the regulator, out the switch. It would also light the little LED, and then it would come out here. Again, the outer one is positive, the inner one is negative, and this would hook up to the fan directly like so, and you would get a low speed. You flick it in the middle, it would shut off completely, and then you flick it to high, and it would go obviously high speed, but this time it's pulling power from the 12-volt relay instead of 5, and you're getting the full power out to the fan. And it was just a cheap, easy way to make a high-low fan connector. And the other end of this connected to just a standard wall wart, like a 16-volt wall wart, an unregulated linear power supply, and that would plug into a power strip. Now this computer sat in a rack, as mentioned, and you can see the ears up here. And this is what's called a 4-unit case because the thickness is as thick as 4 single units. And I had a single space above it for air, and that had a long cover over the front of it with slits in it for ventilation, and I had one of these drilled into it, so there was just a hole for the switch and then 2 holes for the LEDs, and it sat facing frontward out like that. Then this wire ran over to it just like so, and the rest of this was all completely open. And then right above that was a 1-space audio interface that had I think it was like 10 in, 10 out, MIDI, like that kind of stuff. That was right above it, and then there was another space because the book recommended keeping a space on between the the top and the bottom of the audio device to keep it cool. So there was another one of those little blanks, and then above that was a MIDI machine, which was an 8-input, 8-output MIDI device basically that ran off a USB, and that also got hooked to this computer. And the reason why I had that was because I just at the time had a lot of MIDI devices, and the 2 ports that came on the audio interface just weren't enough, so I needed to go to an 8-port unit. And then above that was a power strip, and everything wired into that power strip. You can flick the thing on, the whole rack would come on, and all you needed to bring besides this case that this whole thing sat in was a monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse. And in an ideal world, I would have a KVM system that a server would use that you could actually slide out of a rack, and that would mount on the top. So for all intent and purpose, the whole thing could be an exclusive computer system that you can just put these covers on the front and the back of the case and have it be a road-ready kind of computer system. A studio to go, as I mentioned. Well, there really isn't any much more to do except for get this hooked back up to my KVM here and power the thing up and see if she does indeed work. And as I'm screwing the top in, I forgot to mention this particular fan is very loud because it pushes out a lot of air. So the idea was is during recording sessions or wherever you needed quiet, you can shut the fan completely off. There's enough in here to keep this thing relatively cool, but then when you're done with your recording session, you can flip this thing on and have it cool down the system a little quicker than the fans in here could do normally. Alright, and it appears to be running fine. I'm going to put the microphone near the computer a little bit so you can actually hear how loud it is. It's not terribly bad. Certainly louder than I'd like it to be myself personally for the situation I was intending to use it in. It's not bad. Don't forget, like I said, this was mounted in a rack system, and you wouldn't have it up on a desk like this. It'd be down underneath, and as long as it's not in the room that you're doing the recording in, it's fine. When I was in the studio, I had a big set of acoustically insulated headphones because I sat right next to the drummer, and I can record the whole band. You heard some bleed through the headphones, but with the sound turned up a little bit in them, it really cut away the room sound pretty good. But yeah, I mean, all in all, it's a pretty decent machine. In case you're wondering, this case I think came from a company called iStarUSA, and it was around $110. It was pretty expensive for what it is. I mean, it does have an aluminum front end over here, and it's kind of specialty. And you can actually take these mounts off here if you really wanted to, but there really isn't any reason to have a rack mount case if you're not going to rack mount it, in my opinion. But yeah, it's a nice unit. I mean, I kind of wish it turned out better. I've mentioned I didn't really want to sell all that stuff. It wasn't like I had to. It wasn't getting utilized enough, and I decided to just do something about it and get rid of it. But there are days I go back and think about it and say, I really wish I still had that stuff. It was a lot of fun messing around with that audio stuff. And I mean, considering now I have a brand new computer and all the parts that were in the older machine that just don't work anymore were supposed to go in this, it's kind of like a bittersweet thing. Like I look over at the shelf and I see all the boxes over there and I say, oh man, there's all that stuff that I meant to put in this, and I really wish it still worked and I could do something like that, you know. And I don't have any racking anymore. I don't have any audio equipment, nothing. It's all gone. Everything, even my keyboards, the whole 9 yards, it just got out of it. But I'm not saying maybe one day, you know, I would love to fiddle around with this stuff, but it's a toy more than it's a hobby for me. My ideal situation would have been I would have had a nice house with a basement set up in it that I could have had all this equipment just there at my disposal just to play with anytime I wanted. But you know, I don't know when that's going to happen, and to just keep sitting on it, it just seemed like the right thing to do. Well, anyway, that's really all I had to add to the rest of this video. I can't really think of anything else that I needed to mention. If there is, then maybe we'll revisit it later. If you guys have any questions of either part 1 or part 2, please feel free to leave them down in the appropriate comment sections, and I'll certainly answer your questions as best as I can. Don't forget to check out my other channels. I have some other videos up on the screen here you can check out, and thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next video.